Welcome to this conversation facilitated by the Susanna Wesley Foundation. At the Foundation, we are a community of scholars and practitioners who promote dialogue, support research and create resources in order to equip churches and those who work in them, and to facilitate the building of flourishing community through transformative change. You can find us at our website, susannawesleyfoundation.org. We hope you enjoy this conversation. My name is Emma Pavey and I work for the Susanna Wesley Foundation based at the University of Roehampton. Our theme in 2021 is Embodied Faith, and in this conversation I'm joined by Phoebe Parkin and Nick Mayhew Smith to talk about embodied faith and our relationship to the environment, to nature, to the planet we live on and with. So, welcome. I wonder if you could both introduce yourselves. Phoebe, do you want to go first?
Sure, yes. I'm Phoebe, I'm 19. I'm serving as the Methodist Youth President for 2020 to 2021, which means that I'm employed full-time by the Methodist Church to represent children and young people of the Methodist Church in Great Britain. And I was elected at Regenerate, which is the youth assembly of the Methodist Church. And I was elected on a campaign of climate justice and the church responding to the climate crisis, children and young people leading the way in that.
Thanks. I feel like you've probably done that before.
Yes, yeah, a lot of times.
Yeah, well, thank you. And Nick?
Yes, I work with Emma at the Susanna Wesley Foundation and the Southlands Methodist Trust. So I've also got my good Methodist credentials on. And my PhD was on Celtic spirituality and looking at the environment and nature and the way that the early Celtic missionaries would go and preach to the birds and quell storms and wander around doing all sorts of wonderful things in the landscape. So I've studied it in kind of the raw historical material. And since then, I've been working on projects to kind of help bring the church forwards in terms of its environmental thinking, recovering some of that ancient wisdom of earlier practices in the church, and also looking at ways in which the church can respond positively to exactly the sort of things Phoebe's looking at, and kind of building the church for the future.
Great, thanks. So Phoebe, you already answered this question a little bit, but you mentioned being youth president. So how does a person get to be youth president other than presumably being a youth?
Yes. So you apply like a normal job application, and then there's an interview process, and it's whittled down to 3 candidates. And those 3 candidates go to Regenerate, and they say why they would like to be youth president, what they would do with the role. And then children and young people have the opportunity to vote, and it's a simple election like that. But I kind of was introduced to the concept of youth presidency through various sort of youth workers and ministers who said, oh, like maybe you should think about this, which, to be honest, I kind of was like, no thanks, I've got my life plan sorted, finish A-levels, go to uni, get a job, yada, yada, yada. But clearly God had other ideas. So yeah, it's quite nice that it's an elected role, but I find that comes with some sort of pressure to deliver because people put their confidence in you. So yeah. That's how you become youth president.
And so did you decide to be youth president because of the theme that you chose to do with the environment and think that was a good way to facilitate that? Or did that come to you afterwards of thinking what your theme could be?
It was sort of both. So within my home church, I found it really important that children and young people had a voice. And as the oldest young person, if that makes sense, I would often be the voice, and I was like, well, this is great, but I want other children and young people to have that opportunity. So I felt quite strongly that the church needed a youth voice, and that I wanted to empower other children to be the voice in their local church. And then I was like looking into what the job involved, and I realised that there needed to be a theme. What's my theme going to be? What am I really passionate about? And then I sort of like realised that I was really passionate about the climate crisis, or tackling the climate crisis to be more specific. And they kind of just like worked, like the two married. I thought this is something that I knew children and young people were really concerned about, and climate justice has a huge link with my faith. So yeah, it's kind of like married, but I would definitely say more the youth representation and advocacy was what drew me to it. And then the climate justice stuff came slightly afterwards.
Yeah. And you mentioned that it has a close connection with your faith. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I've always felt most connected to God in nature. I think at some points that's when like the veil between the divine and the mortal can be at its thinnest. Like when you're out looking over a beautiful valley or the ocean or whatever. And to me, that's where I feel closest with God and feel that I can be in conversation with God and be most authentically myself in that. So I've always found nature to be quite important in terms of connecting with God, but also my calling as a Christian to be a steward of the earth, to be a good steward of creation, and to fight for social justice. You know, climate justice is as much about sharing resources and equity and disabling these inequalities that we have in our global structures as it is about the environment. And, you know, Jesus calls us to be radical and to fight against these injustices. And so to me, a green living is almost like gospel living. And I think for me, I definitely think that God calls us to be stewards, and therefore we have a responsibility to be active in our fight against the climate crisis.
Thanks. Yeah, that must resonate with you, Nick, I would imagine.
Oh, I love the way that the church language is moving very fast. I went to a talk recently, which was held by I'm in the Anglican Church, and it was talking about Christian theology of the environment. And there were lots of young people who are sort of university age who were leading it, who were kind of presenting all this stuff about species extinction and all the problems in the environment. Then there are lots of old duffers, which I'm sort of pretty much on the cusp of being myself, sitting there in the audience watching these young things saying, well, what about the future of the planet and so on? And they'd finished their presentation talking about all of the harm that's being done. And then the response of the audience was very much saying, well, what? Are you saying we can't go on holiday anymore? I think that's a bit unrealistic. So we need to get our heads around that. And it was a real mismatch. It was a kind of real problem there. And the people in the audience weren't anti the environment and so on, but just the idea you had to change. And they were saying, well, you know, we had lots of, you know, we were growing up, we had holidays, cars, we did all this sort of stuff. And we don't think it's realistic that the younger generation is going to miss out on all that. So thanks very much for coming. Very interesting to hear from you. We're going to carry on as we were. A few months later, coronavirus hit, which I think has changed things again. But it was very interesting to me there to see this kind of real sense that we're in a point of transition and there is a generational thing that the church can no longer carry on in the old way, assuming that we're just lords of all creation and that creation is there for us with our kind of real complacency. Things will change. But what really struck me there, sitting between those two and hearing these kind of different points of view, and it's something I'd like to, that Phoebe's already touched on, is the idea that there's a positive story to tell as well. You can talk about climate change and bar charts of species extinction and extreme weather events and so on. And that's kind of quite negative. It's fine, we need to know about it and so on. But actually, I think there's a real, this idea of being connected to God in nature and experiencing God, looking at the ocean and being out in the wild or out in the countryside and so on, and feeling God there. I think there's a real sense of positivity that we have to reclaim and find again in the church, an inspiration in nature. So rather than it being, you know, people bashing each other over the heads and so on with, you know, your carbon footprint is bigger than mine and so on, I think there has to be a more in the church, a real kind of reawakening of creation as being loved by God. And therefore we as Christians are called to love it too, in that same way, to see ourselves as fellow creatures with the environment. So my work has been very much, I've tried always to focus on the positive. And I was quite surprised when Phoebe began with that, because that's exactly, I think, the voice which I've heard missing so often when I've heard these conversations. And I think that's brilliant. You know, being out there and feeling connected to God is a positive reason to do things, and not to see it purely as a negative thing and a quest of denial, but an embrace. And it's true, it's brilliant, isn't it? I mean, is there anywhere that, I'd love to know, Phoebe, that you've gone, that you felt anywhere particularly special, and, you know, any places you've had any particular experiences of almost epiphany?
Gosh, yeah, there's so much that I could unpick from what you just said. I think, yeah, one of the most special places that I go to quite often is I grew up in Shropshire, and in Telford there is the Wrekin, and it's, I don't know how many feet, but it's quite high up, and it's just a lovely walk. And I've been up at all times of day and night, and there's just something so powerful. And I've been up quite a few times at sunrise, and I've been up recently, not this Easter but last Easter, and you go up in the dark and the moon shining, and you get to the top and the sun rises up over Shropshire, and it's just beautiful. It's just amazing. And I've been other times where the clouds been really low and you're above the clouds, and it's almost like the ocean with the way that the clouds are formed, and it's just breathtaking. But there are other times where I've been places like Cornwall, and the sea is just such a crystal blue, and you're like, wow, this is phenomenal. Or seeing pictures of the sky at night with the northern lights, and it's just like, how can this be an accident? It's clearly not. And this creation was made with purpose. And I really love what you said, Nick, about we have to see ourselves as fellow creatures, that God put us in this as part of creation, and he gave us a purpose. And I think sometimes we forget that we are within creation itself, and that's quite a humbling perspective to take sometimes, and a humbling reminder, I find.
I think that's fantastic, because I said epiphany, and then there you are talking about going up a hill, and that is the place of the transfiguration in the Bible. And it's the place where Moses encounters God too, going up above the everyday world, the kind of the city, going out of the inhabited areas, the human spaces of the landscape, into the place where you can't farm and you can't live, on the hills and on the mountains, and going into the non-human spaces of the landscape, and they're encountering the divine. It's such a powerful thing, and people have a real, almost primal and instinctual connection to it. People understand, even though not many people go to church these days, a huge number of people will go out on a pilgrimage walk or some sort of walk to some landscape heritage with a holy history. Someone like Glastonbury, it absolutely stands out as a beacon in the landscape. And it's still a much loved, iconic place that we have, and everybody can connect to that. And I think that's great. That's something that's so universal and powerful. And it runs all the way through the idea of going up somewhere high to encounter the divine. I think it's brilliant to get ourselves out of our everyday mundane affairs. And I love the idea of the mist below you. I think with the, again, the mist at the transfiguration as well, and that view.
Yeah, there's something, like you say, very primal and instinctive about being drawn to these places. I find it really interesting what you said about people's perspectives of going, oh, well, I just don't think that's feasible. We're not going to be able to stop going on holiday. And I don't know whether it's an age thing. It might just be a cultural thing. Because there's just been so many conversations I've had with people where they've gone, well, it's just not a realistic ambition. And I said, well, unfortunately, one way or another, it's going to happen. Either we'll change out of intention, or we'll be forced to change by the climate. And I think to take a more negative spin on it, it's quite challenging when people say, oh, well, technology will save us, we'll be able to find the solutions. And I think that there's something quite positive in going, well, even if that's not true, there's hope that God will be with us through it all, whether we do find solutions or not. And I think as faith people, as people of Christ, we'd be lost if we didn't have hope. And would we really be followers of Christ if we didn't have hope? So I think there's lots of ways that I'm like, it's very frustrating having those conversations where people are quite sort of stuck in their ways. But I also am like, well, God will work through this, and I have to trust and hope that God will do that.
I think that's right. And I think we need to have a kind of broad front approach. You need to look at everything, and you can't just say, well, one thing's going to solve this problem. And you're right, when you say it's cultural as well, I think it is very, very deep. It's so heavily embedded, some sense of what it is to be a fully rounded human being involves having 2 weeks in the sun each year. It's very enculturated how we kind of consider time off and leisure time and so on, and the entitlement, and very deep and hardwired in. I mean, obviously, coronavirus has shaken that up to a large extent, and maybe it gives us a slight pause for a reset. But I think the idea that technology might be the answer, or that lifestyle change might be the answer, or whatever, I really think as Christians, the only way really we can be is to be hope-filled and prophetic, and actually show there is a better way to relate to creation. It's true, a lot of it is not going to happen unless it's done from the centre and mandatory. It's like I'd turn on the light switch and electricity comes out. There's nothing I'm going to do that's going to actually really shift things to making sure that's zero carbon. So a lot of it will have to be organised centrally and mandated. But I think as Christians, you still need to be joyful and hope-filled about it and find positive arguments and ways to connect. And I think, I think one of the real powerful connections, you talked about the ocean as well, I think, when you said about being inspired by God. It's one thing where I think people can agree is the plastic rubbish in the ocean. I was down by the coast just a couple of days ago recording a film about the environment for an online course I'm doing at the Seven Sisters, which is on the south coast. And there's a river that winds into the sea there. And all the way along the river, all the way along, lined along it, is just bits of plastic, blue and green bits of rope and bottles. And it obviously washes through from the Sussex countryside and various towns out into the sea. And it's just like global warming. People may not want to see it's there and so on, but you literally can't look away from this plastic, this physical absolute mess that we've made of it. And everyone loves the sea. No one can say, well, that's acceptable. So we do have points of contact and so on. And I think if you have a session on the environment and you spend a large proportion of it telling people they can't jet off on holiday to their second home in France or whatever, and all the grey heads in the audience frowning and going, well, hang on a sec, I didn't sign up for that. I'm Christian, but that's, come on. That's banging your head against a brick wall, I think, to an extent. But then when you talk to them about loving the environment and nature, you've got also your National Trust members of that demographic as well, old people who value heritage. So I think we need to find, there are chewy bits and there's easy bits. And I think focusing on the creative and the positive side. And, your thing on the reconview, I bet you if you'd started off this conversation with the Anglican thing I had, when you talked about the reconview thing, everyone would have been sat up like meerkats, kind of going, yes, I want this. This is me. That's my National Trust landscape thing. Do you give talks and so on to people about the environment in your work?
Yes. So fortunately, I've been asked a couple of times to go and speak to conferences or share my views on certain things. And I think probably the people that I talk to are mostly convinced about this stuff anyway, in the sense that they're already engaged with it. Yes, there's still some of them who choose to jet off on holiday, but it's less. There's less persuasion needed for those groups. I think it's starting the engagement that's really difficult, and we don't live in a society that's homogenous. We've got a society that's so diverse, and understandably, there's lots of people who go, well, I don't really care about the environment because I'm just struggling to put food on the table or whatever. And I think that those are the groups of people where it's really hard to engage those conversations because rightly they've got a lot of other problems that they prioritize. And to me, that just speaks of the wider climate justice that needs to be done, and not separating these issues in the fact that when things do get worse, if they do get worse, which they probably will, it will be the poorer communities, the poorest communities that will be worse affected. So it's really hard, I found, to even start the conversations with people who really mostly need those conversations. But there was a really interesting website that I found, and I think it's called Britain Talks, I'm not sure, but it takes down different groups or subsets of society and explains, well, this is where they come from, this is their viewpoint, and actually how best to persuade somebody. It's really interesting what you said, that those groups of people who might not be persuaded by being told they can't go on holiday, but talking to them about their heritage or whatever would be much more persuasive. And it's really interesting, this website does go into that much deeper way, going, well, these are the people and this is how you talk to them. And I find that that's so interesting, and I think sometimes I need to challenge myself to change the way I tell the narrative so that it engages people and meets them where they're at, not in a negative way or condescending way, but actually recognise that we are all different and therefore our approach to everything will be different. So yeah, it's really interesting that we've both had those experiences. But I don't know how to start those conversations on a practical level. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I think what I found with it all in the church is one way, if you want to get people with pitchforks running after you in religion, is to come with a new idea.
Yeah.
Religion doesn't like new ideas. So I've found that what's worked well with me, and I haven't had any pitchforks brandished at me, is this idea that we can look back in our past in the church and look back into what the church has done in earlier generations. And there is a real sense in something like Celtic Christianity of a connection to nature, of a real fragility of the human strung out between the sea and the sky. There's us and there's God, and there's nothing else that really is, that we don't have any power over and above. The sea, for example, was seen as a great divine realm, and that we are powerless in the face of the divine, and a real sense of humility there. And also no sense that either that they could destroy the environment or that they would ever, do anything that would. So there's a real kind of innocence in coming to creation as a fellow creature and needing to negotiate around the storms and so on, rather than as we do now, trying to tame them and so on, and trying to bash nature over the head. They had to accommodate it and live alongside it harmoniously. So I think that's a kind of helpful way in religious terms. But then also, just recently I've been doing some work, and maybe this will resonate with you as well, on the Methodist Church and its origins. It was an outdoor church to begin with. They did outdoor preaching. It grew up in the fields and the streets and the parks, not in the church. I mean, partly they were kicked out for being naughty and daring to actually have a bit of energy and so on, and some fresh ideas. Again, that whole thing of fresh ideas in religion. But Methodism was born in the open air. And I do think that's probably, now Methodism's in the chapels. And I do think even in Methodism, there is almost a forgotten legacy there of this great missionary move to take the church outside and so on. Have you ever taken part in any kind of Methodist outdoor, good old-fashioned bits of outdoor preaching?
I mean, I've never preached myself, thankfully, but I've been at harvest time, again, back in my home church. We, as a circuit, took our worship to this play area. So it was like some grass, and there was children's play park. And yeah, it was almost like a harvest festival style worship. And yeah, it was very interesting, and how it was received was interesting, and how many people engaged with it. I think it was really good. I think it was very challenging. When you're in your church building, you feel safe. And particularly with the pandemic, I empathise with that more now. But I think it was really inspiring to be able to do it like in this way, to be able to go out and be outside, particularly at a time like harvest. And I think it's really interesting that you brought that up, because I haven't really thought about how it connects us with nature. And actually, I missed a trick with that, in the sense that, yes, I'm all for evangelizing and going out there, but there's something about going out there and being among nature in our worship, in our preaching, in our evangelizing. And it's really interesting that there's so many children and young people who I've met over this year who have also said, oh, let's do forest church, or let's do beach church. And there is this enthusiasm, and I haven't really linked it to the environment until you said, so that's really interesting. But I understand the challenge. And I think our prayer should be God giving us the courage to go for it.
I'm really glad you mentioned Forest Church. I'd forgotten entirely about that. But of course, that's that same expression, isn't it, again? And I think really we've got to own up to the fact that our chapels and churches are not the most enticing of places, particularly for young people. Just as, the Wesleys discovered that going out and meeting people where they are worked, I think the church now needs to remember that renewal and re-energizing and so on typically takes place outside the established four walls of the church. And it's something that you look at all the way through. John the Baptist began his great preaching of renewal, repentance, cleaning, starting again in the wilderness. He went out and he was there. He went into the desert and so on. He pushed himself into the edge of the landscape. And it's so often in church history that renewal comes from the edges. St. Francis of Assisi, he went out and wanted to renew and put energy back into the church. So he pushed again into taking to the streets, moved away from the town, walked away from his father's house and so on. So they push out into the landscape. And again, you've got at the Reformation, a lot of people stopped going to the church and would meet in secret in the countryside and have clandestine meetings away where they could, have prayers and so on without being interrupted. And again, with the Methodists, they left the buildings and the comfort. So renewal, to my mind, always comes from the margins, from outside the buildings, from the landscape, from the countryside. Obviously, we need to talk to the centre and to the community and so on. But I do think that we get reinvigorated with literally fresh air comes in, blows away the cobwebs. When we go out and we say, we're not just going to sit in church on Sundays moaning that no one's coming and scowling out the window at anybody going shopping and so on, that's not going to do it. My daughter's 14 and getting her into church is hard. It's not a very interesting place to be. And yet we go out and do stuff as a local ecumenical churches together. We go and do things in the landscape, and we did a river blessing. We got her to scatter flower petals and the other children to do kind of putting flower petals on the river and so on. It was all running around and having a picnic and so on. It was outdoors, and it was way, way more interesting for them than sitting inside a building. We're not going to engage people unless we use all parts of Christian history and tradition. And I just think, well, why not? There may be some Christians who say, well, you shouldn't be doing a river blessing. That's an appalling thing. But, you've got in the River Jordan is where it all begins. That's the first thing that Jesus, he goes into the River Jordan at the very start of his ministry, is baptized, then goes into the wilderness for 40 days to live with the wild animals. That's a pretty good pattern. Young people and so on will be more inclined to enjoy that than they would be being stuck indoors, being preached at with bar charts of species extinction or whatever. I think there is a real kind of compelling case to be made. And as we say, coronavirus, as you say as well, it's this real sense of the freedom to worship and so on. It has changed things a lot. I'm quite cynical, and I think probably people will just go back to where they were before. My own view is. Do you think it's a great moment and things will be better and different afterwards? What's your view on it?
Gosh, well, it depends whether I'm feeling optimistic or pessimistic, to be honest. There's part of me that thinks this will be a change. I don't see that there's not going to be any form of change whatsoever. I think that there will be groups or maybe individual churches who go back to what they were doing before. And I don't think that's a completely negative thing. I think there are some things that we learn that we really value from the way we do things before. I also think that there are groups who have flourished and will change as a result of the pandemic. There's so many churches who are doing hybrid church or live streams of church, and I don't see that stopping, and I really pray that it doesn't. I think what it is down to is how courageous or brave feeling, and I think it's very understandable that temptation to go back, and really I think it will take a lot of courage to change, but I don't see it as impossible actually. I can already see that there's so much change that has already happened that I would really struggle to see it being completely undone. And I think that what we really need to focus on is what have we not changed as a result of the pandemic, in the sense of we've seen the pandemic has shown how much digital inequality there is. And we've seen not just only digital inequality, but socioeconomic inequality. And the pandemic hasn't really changed that. And the pandemic hasn't really changed what we do about that. Yes, we've all said, yeah, we've learned from it and we need to change. But I think at the moment, I feel frustrated that we've recognised that change and not made it. And I think that the church obviously has a role in that. But I also think that the pandemic has drawn people to explore faith, spirituality, life's big questions. And I think the church is being called, to allow people to have those conversations about faith and spirituality, and to be a safe space to explore these things. I'm going to have to be very careful, because I absolutely think that our Christian faith and followers of Jesus is the way forward, but just allowing that space for people to be, and being honest in our humanness as a church. So lots of things that I think we could really change, and I do see hints of that happening already. I worry that some people will be left behind and some people won't, and I think that will be a bigger issue than whether we do or don't.
I think that's an excellent answer. I hadn't actually occurred to me when I said I was quite cynical about whether people would actually change and say, yeah, you're right, I don't need to go on holiday or whatever it'd be, or I don't need to go and buy so much stuff. Actually, you're right. That's a point I wasn't even thinking about, but this social inequality. And I think there's been a lot of that has got worse, the divide, the digital divide, and a lot of education has fallen behind for many children who just haven't had the access and so on. And I think you're right. I really do. It's something that I need to think about more, is social justice as being part of climate justice, across the board, not just in terms of the layers of society, but also globally, in terms of, sharing out between different countries and so on. We're all connected on the one planet. It has to be the big thinking. It's all very well for me to talk about spirituality and nature and so on, and say we should go outside of society into the fields. Actually, that's only good up to a point, because we do have a lot of social inequality, which will entrench, the throwaway culture. You buy the cheap stuff. It's almost, they talk about it being a poverty tax, because you'll buy a cheap pair of shoes, they'll fall apart more quickly, so you'll have to buy another pair. So you kind of end up over consuming, which works very well for some, but as an environmental thing, it doesn't. Or you buy the cheapest food and so on, which will be farmed in the most unenvironmental way possible. There are all these big issues which actually, they need to be drawn in, and this has been a good reminder talking to you. Actually, you can go off and be a Celtic hermit and go and talk to the birds and so on, but there is a real social need at the centre as well. So thank you for that. That needs to be held in tension. And as I say, I think the problem always is, I've always been quite passionate from student days onwards about, quite ideological and so on, and fairly political and green stuff and social issues. But actually, I think it's quite healthy to say there aren't any single clear answers, but to see it as a broad front on many, many different levels. And a point of engagement where you can engage with people is to work there to push at the open doors, and not to see it as being a kind of blueprint. I think that's important. And I think that some of the voices I'm hearing when I saw some of the environmental stuff, when they talk, even, David Attenborough is the old generation. He talks about loving and wondering at nature, and that's part of it. The climate strike and so on is another part. And that's a broad alliance. I think that's healthy. I think it's healthy in religion as well, to do it ecumenically, really across the board. Do you do much kind of work ecumenically? Because what you're saying, Laudato Si and the Catholic Church would be receptive a lot to what you're doing.
So my closest ecumenical partner is with the URC, and that's generally because the URC has the youth moderator, which is basically the equivalent of the youth president, and they have the youth exec, who are like a team of young people who work. And similarly, the Methodist Church has the youth reps, who basically do what I do, just on a voluntary basis. And so that makes it a lot easier to tap into and work together. And it's really interesting that the things that have come out of our conversations is that young people in both churches care about the environment, about ensuring that people's mental health is taken care of, and about equality and, social justice. So it's really interesting that both groups have these shared interests or shared manifestos. But yeah, it's really hard to work with other churches, because we've really struggled to find young people who we can get in contact with in the Church of England or in the Catholic Church. And that makes things very difficult, because it's very hard to actually talk to somebody who's got a very wide perspective in the same way that we have as youth representatives. But I completely agree with you that we really are keen on building ecumenism, and we have 2 ecumenical reps whose their entire voluntary stuff is done on building ecumenical relationships. So I think that what we'd be really keen to see is other churches reaching out to us as well and saying, oh, look, here's some young people that we know who are really passionate about this. But I completely agree with you that it needs to come from not just the Methodist Church or the URC, but from all churches, but also not just from all the churches as institutions, but all the people who make up those churches. Methodism is quite a connectional church, in that our local church has just as much influence really as our institutional church. And that means that the people hold a lot of power and a lot of responsibility as members of the church. So it's really hard when you have to put aside other sort of theological or ideological differences, whether that's political or religious, to be able to work towards something. And I have to challenge myself sometimes and be like, well, you have to see beyond what these people think about a certain issue and work with them on the environment. At the same time, obviously, there's nuance to all of this. And I think there is some level of accountability that we need to hold against people and have those quite difficult conversations in order to create those solutions. And sometimes it's easier to just sort of sit in your echo chamber rather than be confronted with other opinions. And I think that not just politically, but in terms of just churches and as an individual, that's quite difficult and something that we all, well, I think I could get better at I can't speak for other people, but yeah.
I get exactly what you're saying. The problem is so large, isn't it? And the damage is so great. And you look at coral reefs being bleached, or you look at the ocean, or the CO2 levels run away and so on. And it is so very big. I mean, there is that real sense of powerlessness and kind of defeatism that can turn people off. And they've studied it. Psychologists have studied it, and they've said people are less responsive to negative news on this sort of thing. People just want to look away because it is grim and it is so negative. So I do think that there is a role for the positivity and so on, and the hope. And I was interested in something, sorry, if I can go back, something you mentioned earlier, Forest Church, you'd said, and also Beach Church, which I've never even heard of, but I can imagine what that is. Have you got any experience of either of those two?
I actually haven't. The churches that I've been attending don't do things like that. It's something I'm very interested in. I think it almost goes back to this sort of not privilege, but circumstance, in the sense that I've never been to a church where Forest Church would make sense, where there is a big woods behind the church building. At the moment, I live in London. Whilst it's considered an urban forest, it's very hard to find somewhere to do Forest Church. So I think that I would really be interested in attending those kind of things. But again, I think we have to balance. Yes, go where you can and be immersed in nature, but use the resources that you've got at the moment. It's okay that if you don't live in a forest or somewhere with loads of nature, then bring nature into your church. Why couldn't you have a service that is a Climate Sunday service or completely focused on the creation? And that's something that's come back time and time again from children and young people that I've met, is they really care about these issues, but they're not hearing stuff from the pulpit about these issues. And I think that's a really powerful lesson, that we can be a church or even individuals who say we care about these things, but if we're not preaching about it, are we bringing our faith and our passions together? And I think that would have a lot more of an impact on people than perhaps having a talk on a Friday evening. If you're sat in your church and the preacher starts talking about the environment and climate justice, even subconsciously you're going to be taking that in. And there are people in the churches who just go to church every Sunday religiously, but who wouldn't go to a talk on a Friday night. So I think that was really powerful, that yes, I would love to do Forest Church. And I think there's something so important about it, and it challenges us to do things differently. But there's so many things that we could be doing differently, even within our church buildings or even within the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And I hope that there's some more intentionality within churches and local churches to start bringing these conversations into our services and our way of life as Christians.
I think, and looking at what the Methodist Church has done in the past, there was also, there was the outdoor preaching and so on, but there was also a real sense to something called the love feasts, which were like basically picnics, which were going outdoors and sharing a meal. And it was ritualized meal, but it wasn't a Eucharist. So I think it's something that you could do as an ecumenical thing as well, as a community. And I'm going to try and revive this whole idea of having a kind of ritualized, a glorified picnic, if you like. I mean, it's not much, it's human nature, and religion at its best is simply there directing human nature towards its most fundamental needs, building community, sharing a meal and so on, and being outdoors. And it's one thing that it struck me very much recently in Winchelsea, at the church of Winchelsea on the south coast. There's a churchyard there, and there's a tree growing outside the churchyard, and it's where John Wesley preached his last outdoor sermon, and it's called the Wesley tree. And I just thought, this is wonderful. The most, a really reformed preacher who was very far removed from kind of medieval spirituality and sacred trees and all that kind of Old Testament-y type landscape stuff. And yet there we have a place, a tree, which has got a sign on it, the Wesley tree, where he preached his last outdoor sermon. And it really struck me going there that there are formal patterns of worship, preaching and sermons and so on, which work really well as places to renew the faith and as places to start on a new conversation. And John Wesley was a vegetarian.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating because it's only in his very last years when he actually started, and you can almost see the two parts of his brain started to connect. And he did preach once or twice about vegetarianism or about animals. and so on. You can just start to see the formation. Maybe if he'd lived another 10 years, he'd have given it more thought. But as an old man, he started to reconcile those two bits. And he never really saw his vegetarianism early on as being an aspect of his faith. And at the very end, he talks about, he looks at the animals around, which he loved. And he says, well, yeah, maybe they will be there in the great reconciliation between us and God at the end time and so on. Yeah, these things, which I quite like as a kind of side issue, maybe they are part of God's creation. And he did ponder, whether there would be a kind of cosmological salvation, whether God's salvation was actually for the whole of the cosmos, or whether it was just for human souls, which is the very, very, very Protestant line of things, which I think is a very damaging theology. And I loved the fact that he saw that these two parts of his life, he could actually see that there is a sense that animals play a part in the story of salvation. And I think that's really important. And it was important for him, this is a kind of churchy point, but he saw the sacraments, bread and wine, those are natural products. Part of the material world can be vessels for God's love and God's grace. So I think having that sacramental faith and sharing communion, a meal, again, like the love feast and so on, bread from the ground, the wine from the vine and so on, actually sharing in the material expressions, outpourings of God's love, is there in the physical as well as in just what we preach when we read the Bible. There's actual ritualized expressions of faith. I think that's very important. And I think what you say about church, really, people going to church every Sunday religiously, quite right too, and so on. It's like, well, okay, they're there. Use that opportunity to talk to them as well and to explain. And maybe people have these compartmentalized bits of their brain, like Wesley being a vegetarian for all those years, decades. And he never really thought, hang on, how does that relate to my faith? Until the very end. I don't know what you think about that. Maybe we do think too compartmentally, and we don't tend to think what happens in church is there, and that's all about your morality and behaving well, and then going shopping, that's another thing, and so on. Maybe that's true.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so interesting that you talked about Wesley, because I was just going to say, he wrote all this at the time reasonably forward-thinking ideas about self-care and looking after yourself. I mean, some of his ideas were a bit baffling, like, he didn't have the solutions for everything, but his idea of drinking lots of water, not overindulging in food, doing regular exercise, being outside. And I think it's really interesting, perhaps he didn't link it with his faith, but it goes back to what we said right at the beginning. As humans, we are human and we're still part of this sort of environment and creation, and you can't separate us from that. And John Wesley picked up on that when he wrote about looking after ourselves. And I think that's such a fascinating part of our way as humans and Christians, living almost sort of instinctively and living very simply. I think it's easy to compartmentalize church. I say church because I think that's different from faith. It's easy to compartmentalize church because you do go on a Sunday or wherever you go, and it is a particular ritual. And in any way you see it, whatever church you go to, there is a ritual around going to church. And I think we're called as humans, funnily enough, to compartmentalize our lives because that's how we cope with things. I think that's a very normal and innate part of how the human brain works. That's why we're called to live by faith, which is different from living as a church. We're called to live by faith, and from that your faith goes through everything. Now, that's not saying that you would live a perfect life, because that's impossible, but we have the ambition of living a life that reflects Jesus's love. And I think that that's a thing that I feel makes a big difference as to somebody who goes to church and somebody who lives by faith. And I wonder whether it's easier to just go to church and compartmentalize that part of your life, particularly because going to church is seen now as quite traditional and backwards, and we don't live in a Christian country. We live in a largely atheist country, to be honest. And so I kind of understand it, but that's where living by faith is challenging, but also life-giving. And what makes us stand out as people of faith is the way we live, which is quite a powerful task to be given. So yeah, in a long-winded way, yes, I agree with you. I think it's very easy to compartmentalize things.
And I think the church has always been called to have a prophetic witness as well, and to kind of shake people up as well. We can play it safe and so on, and the church can be very small and apologetic and kind of basically sort of wind itself down quietly, almost, like an apologizing as it sort of puts everything back to how it was and just sort of retreating, or it can have a prophetic voice and so on. And I've loved the way even some priests have taken part in some protests and, have shaken people up. But there is a prophetic voice to be had and to be heard as well. And I think there is a case, certainly on the climate and environment, to say, well, we're not going to ignore this one and we're not going to tidy it away, but we will take a prophetic stance on it and we will challenge people and we will be slightly disruptive in whichever way that would sort of suit. I mean, not everybody's going to be there stopping the traffic and so on, but I do think there's nothing wrong with the church being a bit countercultural and so on. That's hardwired into our DNA. And I always think another thing as well, which I think perhaps, I don't know, do you feel it? I mean, I do just think sometimes I just don't do enough, really. And the real sense of like, well, I've got down the road from me a zero waste shop. And I always just think, I can't wait to go and buy my zero waste stuff. And invariably, whenever I get near it, I think, I haven't got boxes or I haven't got the stuff I need. Go and do it. So you can then go into local supermarket and buy the stuff in the plastic bags and so on. Maybe I'm a more dreadful person than you, and I'm sure I am. But, do you think there is a sense where, the biggest charge you can lay against Christians is being hypocrites, that we can try and be prophetic, but we will ourselves fail and we will do stuff that isn't good and we will jump on a plane occasionally or whatever? Do you feel that, or do you actually think that there is a real sense that actually we're doing things better than they were done in the past? Where do you place yourself with that?
Gosh. So I think that it would be very easy to be labelled a hypocrite, depending on how you portray the message that you give. I think that there's something that goes hand in hand with our Christian faith and eco-living, in the sense of we know we are imperfect. We are aware that we are imperfect, and actually we know that God forgives us in our imperfectness and loves us in our imperfectness. And saying, well, yes, you can absolutely be a Christian and be somebody who cares about the environment and live an imperfect life, as long as you yourself are aware of that. And I think that there's lots of people who I've met who are very aware. They say, well, I'm really passionate and I try my best, but trying my best doesn't equate to being perfect. And I think that there's something very persuasive in that. I study A-level psychology, so I'm not a psychologist, but when we study minority change, they say that having flexibility makes people more persuaded by your voice, and having that openness and humility to say, yes, we do things wrong. That doesn't mean that we think that we should all be doing better. And I've had this conversation with lots of people, and they've said, oh yes, but I don't feel like I should be able to call somebody out for their behaviour because I don't do things perfectly. And I'm like, well, we call somebody out for being racist. We say that's wrong, you shouldn't do that. And I'm not trying to downplay racism here at all. But in the same way, when somebody does something wrong, we're called to hold them accountable, but also accept and expect to be held accountable ourselves. And linking on to that, I think there's something very important about kind activism, not only being kind to other people and accepting that we are all different, we are all in different circumstances, and therefore our abilities to do things will be different. And that's okay. If we try our best, if we all try our best, then that's better than nothing. But also kind to ourselves and saying, it's okay to not be perfect, and actually being perfect is impossible, and it's an impossible standard to hold yourself up to, especially in terms of environment things. I think that it's very easy to lose that kindness to yourself and to other people. The best way that somebody put it that I heard was, we don't need a few people doing green living perfectly, we need millions of people doing it imperfectly. So I think that there is a danger of being labelled hypocrites, but that's if you aren't humble or self-aware enough to be able to see that you aren't perfect yourself, and that's okay. But also holding each other accountable. So balancing those two ways of being.
I really like the answer to that, and I'm glad that kind of occurred to me, because it is something that's thrown at us. And I know that a lot of us cynical people will look at anybody who's young and environmental and so on, will say, well, yeah, you wait until you've got a car and a house and everything else. And that kind of cynicism is deadly. And I think also as Christians, we are able to accept the need for change. Being a Christian means being able to change yourself more than anything else. I mean, being able to have hope, to think that there is a better version of yourself out there, represented in the form of Jesus Christ, who we can come closer to. And I think there is that perpetual belief that we are forgiven, and that we will fall down and we will make mistakes, but we are forgiven again. And I've never really tied that up to the sense of this kind of hypocrite claim, which I hear quite a bit. You do come across it, and it is a problem. It is one of those blocks to change. I think all this nonsense that Christians have to be better than everybody else. I don't know where it comes from, really, the idea that Christians are more likely to be, earn more money and have more perfect lifestyles and so on. I certainly, as somebody who goes to local church, I would never claim that. In fact, Christ came for the sick rather than the healthy. So I actually think it's quite good to embrace what we've got, the kind of damage and the pain and the sore things and so on, the brokenness in society, and to acknowledge that we do, on the environment particularly, we do get it wrong ourselves. I think that's quite a disarming way to deal with it and say, I am in need of God's grace to get this done, and I'm in need of forgiveness all the time, because there is that, when we're talking just after Easter here, there is that hope of the resurrection, that we can be renewed again and made new and come out of that tomb ourselves. So I like that as an answer to the hypocrite thing. And I think particularly in a church setting, when somebody says that's a bit hypocritical or whatever, and that was a theme as well running through when I talk about this event I went to, a real sense of, well, you're just young and idealistic because you can't jet off 4 times a year to your house in the south of France. I think that's a really, really good rejoinder to remember that we are all sinners. And this is part of our sin, and not caring for creation and being thoughtless and selfish and proud. That is a large dimension to it. So I love that as a thing. It's only in dialogue that's come out, really, that sense. So I did rather throw the charge of what if we're called hypocrites at you, but it does come back to our faith. It really does. It is a kind of a way of living out the gospel and being hope-filled and reconciled and forgiven. I think that's a really important aspect to it. Thank you.
All right. Emma, I don't know whether we answered all of your questions. So we kind of just got talking.
I wanted to give Nick the chance to talk a bit about the project that he's been working on, because I think when in the beginning you talked about being out in landscape and the impact of that, and also choosing the carrot over the stick, I think, as a more effective way of engaging people. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about that project, Nick.
Yes, well, the book I've just put together, is called Landscape Liturgies, and it arose from another very productive conversation I had with some other Methodists at the Southlands Methodist Trust and the Susanna Wesley Foundation, talking about how church has in its history, all the way through from the 2nd century onwards, large bits of church ritual which used to take place outdoors and were directed at the environment. And it was done in an intentional and a meaningful way. So even in the very early church, they would have baptism in the river, and it had to be a river, it had to be flowing water that they would use, maybe because it was felt to have some spiritual charge. And they would talk about the baptism would be a blessing of the water, as well as the person going into the water. It would also be a blessing of the river itself, which is something that we don't particularly have in the church now. Baptism is a little bit of water splashed on a baby's head and so on. But the church had a bigger cosmological vision for the power of church ritual to bleed out into the landscape. So in the Anglo-Saxon church, there will be blessings for trees, tree plantings, you would say a prayer and a blessing. And we also found for this book I've just put together, an Anglo-Saxon blessing for a polluted well. And I thought, well, that's relevant. Dust that one off. That works. And there it was, 1,200 years ago, people were saying prayers over a polluted watercourse. It's like, well, I can see the relevance of that today, but no one's had these prayers out as a kind of service book. There are service books which are written, very nice and properly bound, all about what happens within the 4 walls of the church, lots of church ritual and so on. So this book is actually a compilation of all the other bits of liturgy and ritual which took place in the outdoors, everything from a blessing of a tree, crop blessings, rogation services, which is the one thing that kind of continues in the church, and even what liturgies would take place and rituals on hilltops. And we've even got a kind of hilltop liturgy, which you can use up in the Wrekin in Shropshire one day, I'm sure. What do you do when you go up a hill to pray to God? There were patterns of worship that were used in the past in the landscape. So my book pulls those together. And we include 1 or 2 bits of Methodist heritage too, where the Methodists would go and preach outdoors, and we'd look at what would actually happen there and try and give people back this ritual language. And we've kind of forgotten about it, or we've brought it all into the church and so on. But I think what I'd like to see happening more is this idea of things like a river blessing. And I talked about my daughter sprinkling flower petals on our local river. And, she loved it and it was great. And we got the local kids came along and they enjoyed that kind of thing in a way that they didn't or wouldn't if we just sat in church and said some very set prayers. Why not push the liturgy out and the ritual out, as the Wesleys did and so on, and as church reform has done? So that book's out in the autumn, and it's a Susanna Wesley production, if you like. So it's been sponsored by Susanna Wesley Foundation. So I look forward to kind of promoting that, and we'll be doing some work with the Methodist Church in particular. I'm sure Phoebe will be interested in at least one of the services in there, just to remind people that God's grace is found out there as well as within the four walls of the church.
That's a great resource. Yeah, that would be really, really nice to see. I wonder if we could close just by, we've heard about the Wrekin Hills and the ocean and the forest and the beach. Nico, I wondered if you had a recommendation of where people can go to experience nature and God's creation.
Well, I think I would say that there are so many natural features which have accumulated stories around them. The sea is a great place to remind us of the infinite and the divine power, the chaos and the beginning, the most unruly of all the elements. Hills are another place where in the early church they would build churches or chapels on top of them to remind themselves of something important and spiritual. And also I think another great kind of expression of spirituality which has been forgotten is around trees and so on. And it's very much, if you look at the early church, the trees were tribal meeting places. Before you had the church infrastructure, the earliest saints would go and preach underneath the tribal tree. This is in Celtic and in our Irish tradition. There was no infrastructure, so the church had to make do, like the Wesley brothers themselves did much later on with the Wesley tree. And so it was almost, the church was an outdoor gathering. It would take place at the foot of a tree, and the tree was seen as sacred. The tree was seen as a place where you couldn't use weapons, so you had to leave your weapons away from this kind of grove, if you like, this place set apart from human rules. And it was almost that there was a sense that the tree protected us. Rather nowadays, we protect the tree. But I think that real sense of being humble in the face of creation, and remember that actually the ocean needs protection from us. The trees need protection from us. The birds, the mountains and so on, they need protection from us, rather than the sense we have now that we need to insulate ourselves from them, we need to tame them and manage them, and we need to be more powerful. But a real sense of humility in the face of the great power and the great majesty of God found in nature. I think turn it on its head a bit, be a bit counterintuitive about it, as Jesus was with the parables, and say that they protect us. The birds out there that Francis of Assisi preached to and so on, without them, the ecosystems are going to collapse. So nature conservation works two ways. And I think as a Christian, to go in humbly and say, actually, the tree saves our planet from burning up and so on. To look at it that way, I think that's a really Christian approach. Have that humility.
Well, thank you very much for this conversation. It was really rich. There's a lot there. Yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for asking me. It was amazing. Yeah, it'd be good to keep in touch with you both.
That's been brilliant. Really, really good.
Thank you for listening to this conversation facilitated by the Susanna Wesley Foundation. You can engage with our work through following us on Twitter and Facebook, and at our website susannawesleyfoundation.org. We would love to hear from you.